What's Bible for?
The Bible says
The
Bible says love.
I like to all them stories and songs from the Bible.
And what's the Bible teach us?
I believe what the Bible teaches.
Because it's in the Bible.
There are experts on the Bible.
Back in the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists started digging around the ancient Near East and found some really cool stuff that's totally changed how we understand the Bible. Nowadays, you can't really study the Old Testament without thinking about these discoveries. Thanks to these finds, we can now read ancient languages like Egyptian hieroglyphs and Sumerian, which were used way before Abraham's time and even during the time the Bible was written. This gives us some awesome insights into the history and religious practices that were going on back then. But here's a twist. These discoveries show that the religion of the Israelites was pretty similar to what was happening around them in the ancient Near East. So it makes you wonder, how unique was Israel's religion as described in the Old Testament? A lot of Israel's customs and religious practices have parallels with those of their neighbors, which makes us think about how all this fits into the big picture of the Bible being inspired by God. So what's similar? It's not shocking to find out that Israel and its neighbors had a lot in common. The languages they spoke were pretty similar, so that's a given. For example, the name El was used for the top god in the Canaanite religion, and in the Bible, the word El is used as a title for Israel's God. But just because the words are the same doesn't mean they're talking about the same God. What's really interesting is how they use similar phrases or roles. For example, in Israel, a prophet was sometimes called a man of God. There's this old Phoenician seal that says, belonging to Baal, Yatan, the man of God, who depends on Melkort. Melkort was the big deity in Tyre, and this guy was his prophet. Or take Naram Sin, the grandson of Sargon, who said, the shining morning star spoke from heaven, thus. That's similar to how Yeshua is called the morning star in the New Testament. The Canaanites had a phrase like, you will be numbered among those who have descended into the earth, which sounds a lot like Psalm 88, verse 4. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. So, you see, they had similar ways of talking about things, like death. Kings back then often said stuff like, I lifted up my hands to the Lord of heaven, and the Lord of heaven answered me through seers and messengers, saying, don't worry, I have made you king, and I'll protect you from all these other kings who are trying to fight you. This sounds like something straight out of the Bible, but it's actually from a king in northern Syria from around 758 BC. The same kind of ideals, like a warrior god who helps out his king in battle, show up in the Old Testament too. Also, phrases like lifting up the hands and the title seer were common in both Israel and their neighbors' cultures. The ideal that kings needed their gods to win battles isn't just in the Bible. There's an Assyrian king who said, it wasn't by my own strength or my bow, but by the power of my goddesses that I made other lands submit. That's pretty close to what the psalmist said. I do not trust in my bow, my sword does not bring me victory, but you give us victory over our enemies. The basic ideal is the same in both texts. The concept of harem, or wars where everything was destroyed, shows up in the Old Testament when God commands Israel to destroy certain Canaanite cities. It turns out that other cultures also had this kind of war, ordered by their gods, as a way to bring order and security into a chaotic world. In the ancient Near East, gods were often seen as judges, sitting on thrones to pass judgment. There's a prayer from around 2000 to 1500 BC where someone asked the god Shamash, "O Shamash, Lord of judgment, come down to me that you may dine, that ye may sit on the throne and render judgment." This ideal of gods as judges sitting on thrones was pretty common. The Old Testament often talks about how unique Yahweh, the God of Israel, is. Isaiah writes, "To whom will you compare me or count me equal? I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me." Similarly, in Exodus, Moses and Miriam sing, "Who among the gods is like you, O Lord?" But guess what? Other cultures had similar claims. In a hymn to the goddess Gula, she says, "I am sublime in heaven, I am queen in the netherworld. Among the gods I have no peer." And in a hymn to Marduk, they say, "Whatever the gods may have done, they cannot be like you, Lord." So we see that different cultures use similar language to talk about their gods, small g. Even the ideal that God takes care of the world shows up in other cultures. In an Egyptian hymn to Ra, they say things like, "Who creates the herbs that give life to the cattle and the fruit trees for mankind? Who makes that on which the fishes in the river may live and the birds under the heaven?" That's pretty close to Psalm 104, 14, 25, and 27, which says, "He makes grass grow for the cattle and plants for man to cultivate. This is the sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number." Even though there are cultural differences, people seem to have similar ways of talking to God, because we all share some basic ideals about who God is and what He does. The way people wrote things down also had similarities. For example, there's an Akkadian prayer to Ishtar from the middle of the 2nd millennium BC that goes like this: "How long, O my lady, are my enemies to look darkly upon me? Are they to plan evil things against me with lies and deception? Are my persecutors and those who envy me to rejoice over me? How long, O my lady?" Now compare that to Psalm 13, verses 1 and 2. "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long will my enemy triumph over me?" This was a common way to express lament and prayers back then. There are tons more examples of similarities between Israelite literature and the writings from the ancient Near East, but most are just about the style, not the content. In wisdom literature, though, you can see some similar teachings. For example, the Egyptian teachings of Ani advises, "Be on your guard against a woman from abroad, whom no one knows in this city. She is a deep water, the extent of which no one knows. A woman whose husband is far away says daily to you, 'I am polished,' when she has no witnesses. She waits in such a trap, a great crime, and death when it is known." That sounds pretty similar to what Proverbs chapter 7, verses 19 through 27 says. But no one's saying that Proverbs was copied from the Egyptian text. They're just describing a common experience. Even more closely related to Proverbs are the teachings of Amenemope. For example, "Better is poverty from the hand of God than riches in the storehouse. Better is bread when the heart is satisfied than riches with sorrow. This is really close to Proverbs 17:1 and 15:17. This type of better proverb is very common in the Bible, like in Ecclesiastes 4. It seems like Israel and its neighbors use similar forms to express their ideals. Two big social institutions worth mentioning are kingship and covenants, because both have parallels in the ancient Near East. But don't be surprised, Israel wanted a king just like the other nations. 1 Samuel 8 and 5. Still, God shaped the kingship and covenant according to His unique relationship with Israel. Covenants were a common legal thing back then, but the Israelites used them in their own special way. Many of these parallels show that the Bible writers were using the language and practices of their time, which helps us understand the context of the Scriptures. When looking at the similarities between Israel and other ancient Near Eastern nations, some folks find it challenging to talk about Israel's uniqueness. To tackle this, there are two main ways people have approached the issue. First, some focus on what makes Israel stand out, like the biblical ideal of monotheism and Israel's special relationship with one God. Others believe that Israel and its neighbors shared a lot of the same ideals and behaviors, but what makes Israel unique is how they reimagined or adapted those ideals. Interestingly, the role of revelation and inspiration often gets overlooked in these discussions. Instead, the focus tends to be on explaining how Israel's religion developed from a social and sociological perspective. But for those who see the Old Testament as part of the biblical canon, it's hard to ignore the role of divine revelation when considering these similarities. The challenge here is finding a method that lets us appreciate both the similarities and the differences, while also respecting the unique aspects of each religion. Some scholars are working on this and note that comparing religions can be tricky because it's easy to overemphasize similarities and draw conclusions that aren't really backed by the evidence. Still, there are a couple key points to keep in mind. First, we know that Israel shared a lot of cultural elements with the ancient Near East. But second, Israel also stood out as an independent culture with its own identity. The question of Israel's uniqueness in the context of the ancient Near East isn't a new one. The Old Testament itself emphasizes Israel's distinctiveness. In the end, when comparing Israel with its neighbors, we shouldn't lose sight of the biblical focus on Israel's unique role and identity. Here's some tips for studying the similarities. When scholars compare Israel with the ancient Near East, they've come up with some helpful guidelines to keep things in check. Here are a few that really stand out. 1. Look at the differences too. It's super important not to just focus on similarities, but to also check out the differences. If Israel was exactly the same as its neighbors, we wouldn't even be talking about its uniqueness. It's the differences, along with the Bible's claim that Israel is distinct, that make us curious about these similarities in the first place. 2. Start with the Bible. Before jumping into comparisons with other cultures, it's a good idea to see if the Bible itself has similar passages. If there's another part of the Bible that sheds light on what you're studying, that's often more helpful than immediately looking outside the Bible. For example, the Hebrew verb kippur, to make atonement, shows up in various Old Testament rituals, while the Akkadian word kippuru, which means to wipe off, cleanse, is similar. Understanding kippur in the context of the Old Testament reveals that it's about removing sin and impurity, which is quite different from how kippuru is used in Akkadian rituals. 3. Understand the role in Israel first. When looking at things like social customs, it's key to understand how they worked in Israel before comparing them to other cultures. Take kingship, for example. Before drawing comparisons with other ancient kings, you'd want to dive deep into what the role of a king was like in Israel. You'll likely find some big differences that show Israel's approach was unique. 4. Consider cultural context. When you look at parallels, it's crucial to understand what a concept, practice, or institution meant in its own cultural setting. Studying something in isolation could lead to misunderstandings. For example, during the Cold War, both the US and Soviet Union used terms like freedom and liberty, but they meant very different things in each context. Similarly, the Akkadian verb kapuru might seem similar to the biblical kippur, but in Babylonian culture, it was about wiping away disease caused by evil spirits, not sin, which is a big difference from how kippur is used in the Old Testament. And 5. Compare with nearby cultures. When comparing Israel with other cultures, it's best to focus on those that were geographically close or had direct contact with Israel. These cultures will likely offer the most relevant and insightful parallels.